Two speakers joining us today, Dr. Matt Hayler and Dr. Marco. Matt will start us off, then we'll do a short Q&A, and then a little break so you can refill your coffee and breathe for a minute. If anyone hasn't gotten coffee or tea, munchkins, and then Marco will dazzle us, and then we'll open it up to conversation between the two presenters and the audience. So brief bios, Matt Hayler received a PhD in English from Exeter in 2011 and is currently a lecturer in post-45 literature in the Department of English at the University of Birmingham. His research focuses on e-reading, materially experimental writing, digital humanities, technology, and embodiment, and particularly how the materiality of artifacts impacts upon our culture, daily practice, and cognition. His first book, Challenging the Phenomena of Technology, Embodiment, Expertise, and Evolved Knowledge, was published this year by Palgrave. We have 30% off flyer and both over there. Get after that. Marco received a PhD in Comp Lit from the University of Bologna in 2012 and is currently a junior fellow at the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Freiburg. His research explores the phenomenology of narrative, or the structure of the experiences afforded by literary fiction and other forms of narrative media. His first book, The Experientiality of Narrative and an Activist Approach, was published by De Gruyter in 2014. And his second book was accepted for publication by the Ohio State University Press literally like 20 minutes ago. So you can't make that up. Pretty cool. So in addition to both of their first books, I highly recommend checking out some of their recently published articles. Both of these guys put out work at just a frighteningly impressive rate. They're two very, I think, highly proficient early career scholars, and they're doing some of the more exciting research out there. So thanks to both Matt and Marco for joining us today. Thanks to the Graduate Student Organization and the GES for their support. And thank you for coming. So Matt will present first. His paper is entitled Embodied Literary Experience, Pop-ups in the Limn of the Analog Digital Page.
Cool, thank you. Good morning. Where are we? Cool. So I want to talk today about books and bodies, the bodies that hold the books and the bodies that are the books. Thinking about the impacts of embodiment and materiality have really underpinned my research for the last few years. I represent the UK in an e-reading research network called eRead, or Electronic Reading in the Age of Digitization, headed up by Anne Mangan, a reading researcher at the University of Stavanger in Norway. And the network includes academics from the sciences, social sciences and humanities from around 40 European countries. What we're trying to do, our mandate, is combining paradigms from experimental sciences with perspectives from the humanities. The action will develop new research paradigms and metrics for assessing the impact of digitization on reading. These metrics enable the development of evidence-based knowledge of paper and screen reading and provide guidance for practitioners, policymakers, publishers and designers. And so the interdisciplinary scope of the network is captured in its central commitment to a multidimensional, integrative model of reading. Such a model is what researchers involved feel must be considered as a minimum for understanding the effects of all kinds of reading on readers, and I suspect that at least some similar model must become the norm for future work on reading in the digital humanities, whether it's interested in readers' cognitive health, their affect, or text's literary potential. Many aspects of such an integrative approach are not new. They've been part of our textual studies for a long time, but their combination is likely unique and certainly richer than the current default tends to be. So in this regard, the network is committed to seeing reading as an embodied and multisensory experience, and as a human-technology interaction that demands that we consider the entanglement of the rich physicality and related cognition of the user and the particular affordances of the device being used. And this works for me because I've come to see reading as an act which has to be understood as emerging at the nexus of two embodied things, and never the product of information simply bound up in either element, bound up in either the reader or the object that they hold. Derrida and Barth and Kristeva told us a lot of this a while back, but we always seem to keep forgetting, to keep focusing on the words on the page alone, to forget the hands that hold them, the leaves or the screen that cradles them, the milieu in which they exist, and amongst which everything means. To state it bluntly from the outset, I think the texts are something separate from works. That texts are the things that we encounter in a rich moment of use, that they're far more than just words. Texts aren't something that authors write or even that readers produce. They're something that emerges at the heart of a material entanglement that is always itself situated in time, space, and a milieu. And we hear a lot about readers and cultural moments and historical forces in literary research, but what underpins what I want to think about today is the ways in which a work's materiality always conditions the kinds of texts that can emerge, and that textual production, separately from the writing of a work, textual production is a cognitive process that takes place in a messy crossing from the boundary of the skull and skin and out into the world. There's three threads in contemporary psychology and philosophy which have become particularly meaningful in reminding me of all of this recently. One is post-phenomenology, one is radical embodied cognitive science, and the other is so-called 4E cognition, or embedded, extended, enacted, and embodied cognition. And the distinctions and relations between these fields is needlessly subtle for a 30-minute talk. What's important to me is more simple. In different ways, these fields each see human cognition as not simply taking place in the brain, but instead as taking place across a commingling of brain, body, artifact, and environment. True cognition is dependent upon each of these elements, and then only when they're understood in their richest sense. There is a near infinite capacity for what can be brought into both textual meaning and our fundamental cognitive making of meaning. In this understanding, it is the action and situation and body and thought that a human brings together that thinks, and our tools in particular can dramatically shape this distributed thinking when they become a part of the entanglement. The cognitive archaeologist Lambros Malfouris describes this kind of rich thinking assemblage with regards to pottery thrown on a wheel. We should assume that every mental recourse needed to grow a vessel out of clay may well be extended and distributed across the neurons of the potter's brain, the muscles of the potter's sense organs, the affordances of the wheel, the material properties of the clay, the morphological and typological prototypes of existing vessels, and the general social context in which the activity occurs. I do not mean to deny that an intricate computational problem may well arise for the brain the moment the potter touches or is touched by the clay. I simply mean to emphasize that part of the problem's solution is offered by the clay itself, without any need for mental representation. Malfouris asks, how does the potter know how to bring about a pot? In part, there is of course something in her head that does some computational process and draws on her memories and experiences and plans, but a pot is not simply the product of the potter's mind, of a neatly planned intent, but is born instead of an entanglement between the potter's brain, body, the clay, and the conditions of the day. Humid air allows for certain techniques and prevents others. A more dense clay allows for greater height, but less dramatic shapes, for instance. The potter thinks alongside, with, and through the clay, the wheel, and her arms and hands, and it is only their actions together that determine the final shape of the pot in its particularity. These elements each play a role in the shapes that the final pot can take, and the potter feels this out, thinking with her hands and the tools and the matter that they hold, drawing on information that her brain will never consciously contain, cognizing with forces that are as invisible to her as the snap of signals across her neurons. This is a dramatic idea to me, that to think in the supremely human fashion of the expert creator means to think with the world. And part of what I want to talk about today is that this is as true for reading as for the realm of clay, humidity, and the actions of the potter's hands. I don't want to focus on the reader here, but instead on the objects, on the things. Paraphrasing Husserl, I want to return to the books themselves. So let's start with the embodiment of printed literature. Printed books' most significant material features are their covers, their pages, their typography, and the formal arrangements of the words on the page, and the interactions that the commingling of these aspects afford the reader. As I'm predominantly interested in physicality, I'll focus on pages and covers, but formal arrangement and typography are also clearly important, clearly meaningful, with plenty of famous examples of playful arrangements such as Jonathan Safran Foer's Tree of Codes, or Mark Danielewski's House of Leaves, or back to Derrida's Glass, or Sterne's Tristram Shandy. But what kind of response might come from the seemingly simple physicality of a standard printed book? I've got to be careful when dealing with the suggestion that certain kinds of thinking somehow inhere within a codex. A book does not determine any kind of thinking in its users, but it does provoke certain kinds of thought from within the cultural context in which it operates, or more often to restrict certain kinds of thinking. We never think neutrally or from nowhere, but always in concert with the materiality of ourselves, of our environments, and of the objects that we find there. In the same way that cognitive science has come to recognize the ways in which our bodies can come to condition how we think about and encounter the world, so too can the embodied objects that we encounter project elements of themselves, elements of their form, back into our way of thinking. To think this through, I want to appropriate a term from Catherine Hales, material metaphor. For Hales, a material metaphor foregrounds the traffic between words and physical artifacts, drawing attention to connections between a book's script content and its materiality. The longer quote here, she says, "We are not generally accustomed to think of a book as a material metaphor, but in fact it is an artifact whose physical properties and historical usages structure our interactions with it in ways obvious and subtle. In addition to defining the page as a unit of reading and binding pages sequentially to indicate an order of reading, are less obvious conventions such as the opacity of paper, a physical property that defines the page as having two sides whose relationship is linear and sequential rather than interpenetrating and simultaneous." Hales here recognizes some of the ways in which the form of a printed book can promote or suggest things to the reader. And these are elements that can unconsciously structure the text that we produce, or that the author can explicitly play with. Hales here recognizes some of the ways in which the form of a printed book we might think, for instance, of Jane Austen's aside to the reader at the end of the playful Northanger Abbey, where she makes the wonderfully meta comment that her character's anxiety can hardly extend, I fear, to the bosom of my readers, who will see in the telltale compression of the pages before them that we are all hastening together to perfect felicity. The amount of pages resting in our right hands constantly updates us as to the time that we have left in the story world, and this can raise or lower the tension that the author has set up so far. As this wedge thins, we know that there is not long to go, and as Austen satirizes, all romances simply must have a happy ending. If there aren't many pages left, then no character surely can be in any real danger. The material form of the codex then structures the reception of at least the content within it as we go about the process of producing the read text. I would argue, however, that paper books also have the potential to structure the kinds of thinking that follow on after their use. Walter Ong gives us a way into this idea by grounding his discussion of new media in the radically freeing effect of the introduction of the written word as a new technology. He says that since in a primary oral culture, conceptualized knowledge that is not repeated aloud soon vanishes, oral societies must invest great energy in saying over and over again what has been learned arduously over the ages. This need establishes a highly traditionalist or conservative set of mind with good reason, which with good reason inhibits intellectual experimentation. Knowledge is hard to come by and precious. Ong demonstrates that societies which adopt writing hugely expand their capacity for novel thinking, not only through the elimination of repetition for the sake of memory, but also of needless repetition between people working on the same problem. Writing, in a form that is easily copied, preserved, stored, and distributed, transcends time and space, reaching audiences beyond those immediately bodily present. In this way, the codex and codex-like forms have most often been or become radically democratizing. But the history of the use of the writing that is stored within the codex does not uniformly match the message of its physicality. Particularly in the age of the internet and its swiftly produced, amateur-led and often brief and fleeting text, it becomes clear that the codex does not inherently afford caprice or rapid response, instead promoting the positives and negatives of the glacial flow of received wisdom. The forces of history, culture, and society interacting with the equipment have undoubtedly shaped each user's phenomenological experience of the form, but democratized knowledge is not the enduring aspect of its brute embodiment. The defining features of the material codex are not its provision of freedom and novelty, but rather its order, its stability, its sense of authority, which are all products of its boundedness. The covers of a printed text, as Austen well knew, perform this clearly. The object is finished all around with a hard shell. It is discrete. When I put a finished book on the shelf, again both positively and negatively, I have the profound feeling of owning some new chunk of knowledge. The form wins out over the history of its deployment in the phenomenological experience. A history of new freedoms and the democratization of information is supplanted by the particular forces of preservation and continuity that are tied to the arrangement of the pages themselves. So now we need to turn to the much younger technology of electronic text in order to consider the kinds of impact that its own strange embodiment might already have begun to accrue, particularly in light of its troubled relationship with print. Because the ways in which we receive digital text's more complex materiality stems from their divided relationship with both print and computing. When we set them against a history of print, we can understand why digital texts so often appear to be, and are often theoretically positioned as, being intangible, even if e-reading devices such as the Kindle or the iPad clearly are not. In the early 90s, writers such as J. David Bolter and George Landau began to set out the theoretical implications for new digital literature, databases, and environments that were increasingly being adopted. And these writers were enthusiastic about the new forms. They sought largely to see how the American Academy's post-structural strategies of the day could be mapped onto digital products. Little interest was shown in the potential downsides of a shift in media from print to pixels, nor in what was occurring during programming and what effects code and coding might have upon the reader's reception of a text. Digital texts were therefore often treated as evanescent, setting the tone for approaches to digital media throughout the 90s and stabilizing attitudes that still persist today, that digital text is somehow not quite there or not quite here. Since the late 90s, digital humanities research, however, has become increasingly sensitive to the particularities of every aspect of digitization. And Matthew Kirschenbaum's work in Mechanisms marked a real turning point for theoretical discussions regarding the importance of materiality for studies of digital media, meticulously picking apart the physical particularities of the computer and refuting the illusion of the digital as being somehow ethereal. As Kirschenbaum notes, electronic text is locatable, even though we are not accustomed to thinking of it in physical terms. Bits can be measured in microns when recorded on a magnetic hard disk. They can be visualized with technologies such as magnetic force microscopy. In his forensic study, Kirschenbaum demonstrates that whilst it might take some looking, digital texts are always there, always embodied. And we can see here an image of a single bit, the smallest unit of information stored on a hard drive platter. And this kind of work alerts us to the meaningful potential inherent in electronic ways of presenting texts. This kind of work reminds us of the rich and intricate physicality and layering of readable strata that we often neglect when we consider the digital projection of words on a screen. As well as discussing a typically invisible forensic materiality, Kirschenbaum also asserts that all software has an extensive entailment of material elements that should not be forgotten as evidence of its very real place in the world. Software, he says, is the product of white papers, engineering specs, marketing reports, conversations and collaborations, intuitive insights, professionalized expertise, venture capital, late nights, labor, caffeine, and other artificial stimulants. These are material circumstances that leave material, read forensic traces in corporate archives, on whiteboards and legal pads, in countless iterations of alpha versions and beta versions and patches and upgrades and focus groups and user communities, in expense accounts and licensing agreements, in stock options and IPOs, in carpal tunnel braces, in the Bay Area and New Delhi real estate markets, in PowerPoint, vaporware, and proofs of concept binaries locked in timestamp limbo on a server where all the user accounts but one have been disabled and the domain name is 18 months expired. Most significant for me here is that this litany demonstrates that to suppose intangibility at any level of a digital text is simply a misreading. The software has a physical forensic materiality at the level of the hard disk image, and then the materiality that it entails from production to distribution to use, and it is instantiated on a device which is equally physical and entailed, and the whole system of creation and use drifts out into the wider world as equally readable material ripples. That the phenomenological experience is of a potentially discomforting immateriality is born of naivety and the limitations of our senses rather than some valid ontological claim. And yet it persists. Discussing electronic text writing on a PC screen, Hales describes the origin of digital text seemingly spectral materiality, whilst also paying the same attention as Kirschenbaum to the real processes. In the computer, the signifier exists not as a durably inscribed flat mark, but as a screenic image produced by layers of code precisely correlated through correspondence rules, from the electronic polarities that correlate with the bit stream, to the bits that correlate with binary numbers, to the numbers that correlate with higher level statements such as commands and so on. Even when electronic texts simulate the appearance of durably inscribed marks, they are transitory images that need to be constantly refreshed to give the illusion of stable endurance through time. And these facts lead Hayles to argue that electronic text is a process rather than an artifact that one can hold in one's hand. When a book becomes a process to be run on a machine rather than a coherence of inked writing and paper substrate that can be held, this has to have implications for how we conceive of it. We construct our texts within this tension. The digital document, instantiated as a block of script, drives us to our history of print. But its malleable and fleeting appearance on an electronic device also sends us to our experience of various other devices, various other screens. And elsewhere, Hayles states this explicitly. Readers come to digital works with expectations formed by print, including extensive and deep tacit knowledge of letter forms, print conventions, and print literary modes. At the same time, because electronic literature is normally created and performed within a context of networked and programmable media, it is also informed by the powerhouses of contemporary culture, particularly computer games, films, animations, digital arts, graphic design, and electronic visual culture. Here, Hayles identifies the struggle in producing a new model for what a text can be, a shape that does not settle easily and that can only come through repeated interactions. We have a default gestalt for bound book reading that has emerged out of a long history of experience. We are initially forced to apply that paradigm to electronic reading, but such reading is capable of and promotes interactions such as clicking and scrolling and swift changes in communication between content which do not fit our paper book experience. So we have to change our approach to producing a text to include a history that, as Hayles notes, includes all sorts of other screens. They all get folded into what the word book or electronic text can mean. We're essentially building a whole new set of material metaphors to draw upon. Authors have these brand new ways to mean as their readers start to become familiar with both a too frequently hidden history of print materiality and a new selection of meaningful digital devices. To give just one example, I'd like to look at hyperlinks. A hyperlink most typically is an underlined blue word that when it's clicked takes the reader from the page that they are on to somewhere else, known or unknown. The author of the document sets the hyperlink marker, which word or image is clickable, and then they set the destination. The reader chooses whether or not they are going to click on that link. But even an unclicked link has come to possess meaning. Stephen Johnson describes hyperlinks as an entirely new linguistic element. He says that they are the first significant form of punctuation to emerge in centuries, and this is an apt description. Like a comma, question, or exclamation mark, hyperlinked words do not change the words themselves at the level of their letters, but instead augment and alter the meaning and capacity to mean. In early writing systems, pictographic script largely attempted to represent spoken words. The spoken bird in the simplest pictogram would have a representational or symbolic parallel with the image of a bird. I'm cheating a bit here because this is a hieroglyph, and hieroglyphics aren't purely pictographic, but in the scripts that hieroglyphs derived from, a text was accurate if the interpretations of each image matched in some reliable way what the author intended. A chirographic or typographic written word is different. A chirographic or typographic written word is more precise. It is capable of far greater nuance. And part of its ability to both capture more specific and more abstract meanings stems from its representing or coming to represent a spoken word that has been inscribed many times, iterated with its own growing history and malleable context. As the cognitive neuroscientist Marianne Wolf notes in her exploration of the reading brain, linguists classify English as a morphophonemic writing system because it represents both morphemes, units of meaning, and phonemes, units of sound in its spelling. The linguists Noam Chomsky and Carol Chomsky use words like muscle to teach the way that our words carry an entire history within them. For example, the silent C in muscle may seem unnecessary, but in fact it visibly connects the words to its origin, the Latin root musculus, from which we have kindred words such as muscular and musculature. In the latter words, the C is pronounced and represents the phonemic aspect of our alphabet. The silent C of muscle, therefore, visually conveys the morpheme aspect of English. A pictogram of a muscle always means the concept of muscle. Whatever the culture dictated that concept to be, the image would always suggest to the reader their current interpretation of that conventional concept. But if we look at the word muscle with its silent C, then we get the full morphophoneticism of English coming to the fore. The Latin root with its pronounced C hides within. It is a conceptual trace, a history more or less known and more or less effective to the reader. But now paint that word blue and underline it, put it on a screen, and it becomes imbued with possibility. This contraption now means the interpreted cultural concept of the spoken or inscribed muscle, like the pictogram. It alludes to musculus and to a history of use, like the inscribed word, but it also reminds us of everywhere that it might take us. Depending on the context, we might expect to be sent to anatomical diagrams, or bodybuilding tips, or bodyguards for hire, or seafood recipes, or to somewhere else entirely. Depending on the my point is that even an unclicked link has implications for interpretation. Hyperlinks and their apparent manifestations represent a personal aspect to every underlined word, of the choices that we make to access or not the content and connections that they promise. They are hyper-morphophonemic, conceptual, historical, and possible. As Nancy Kaplan asserted 8 years before e-reading really took hold, turning a book's pages adds nothing to signification. The end of a page is an arbitrary boundary imposed by an intransigent material world. Taking a link from here to somewhere else is not the same thing at all, for in the aggregate, the set of chosen links and each link's place in the set plays off against all the sets passed over. That doubleness, the links taken and those passed by, brings a particular reading into being. And this kind of reading cannot help but mean differently, cannot help but provoke us into producing different texts. So I want to end by looking at a book that brings all of these ideas together, in fact requires all of them to read beyond its surface, because it delights in limbing between analog and digital text. In early 2014, I worked on developing a project with the Royal Shakespeare Company and an art team, Kristen and Davey Maguire, and we received an AHRC prototyping grant for what would be described as a theatre book. So this is what a theatre book looks like. At first, the reader is faced with a large wooden-covered book, almost a box. It's laser engraved with Macbeth, and it informs us that this is a retelling of Shakespeare's play. When you open the book, a paper pop-up scene is brought out of the flat folded page, and there is a slight whir and click as a mirror, unseen behind the proscenium arch of the pop-up, raises into position. The paper itself has some key lines from the play, and if you move to one side, you can also look behind the pop-up screen to see some of the hidden mechanism. Tiny paper lighting riggers, directors, and grips act as a good-natured reminder that you're looking where you shouldn't be, trying to spoil the secret behind the scenes of this theatre. It's a visual gag, but it becomes a little extra magic, while simultaneously extending the theatrical metaphor and revealing that it is an illusion. Analog performance isn't how this story will be made. A Pico projector built into the book's spine automatically comes to life as the covers are opened. It shines onto the mirror and is reflected back onto the paper, brightly illuminating it and filling it in. Ethereal music composed for the project begins to play from internal speakers. And as the projected images come to life, with characters walking into the scene, in front of some elements and behind others, and not cartoon animations but real human figures that begin to silently act out key scenes from the play, the illusion is complete. The story has come to life. And the physical form of the book is wholly bounded. There are no wires, there's nothing to plug in. As the first element of the play draws to a close, the music winds down and the scene fades away to re-reveal the cream of the paper and its skeletal pop-up forms. There's no prompt, but the reader knows exactly what to do. She reaches out and she turns the page, returning one set of models to the flat and bringing another up and out. New music begins and a new projected scene fades up into animating this new set, and the next part of the story starts to be enacted. The reader can go back or skip on just by turning the pages, interrupting the flow of the story at her leisure. So how do we go about reading a text like this, one that straddles the line between an electronic projected screen and a paper page? What do we need to be sensitive to? What aspects might play into its particular meaningfulness? So I want to focus on three things: how the theatre book draws on print, how it draws on the digital, and how it brings these concerns together in a cultural moment that lends them a particular weight. With regard to print, the theatre book offers constant reminders of its commitment to the power of materiality. The magic of unfurling layered paper landscapes, the etched wooden covers that speak back to the trees that the paper came from, the small figures that seem to be hard at work in an analogue world. Each of these elements keeps the power of physicality present. With each turn of the leaves, our hands are put to work in bringing the experience into being. We act as directors, as we always have, never wholly responsible for the text, but the driving force behind the combining of aspects which produce that final thing that we encounter. For the artists, for the Maguires, the most important relationship between the theatre book and traditional print is its evocation of reading a book under the covers with a torch as a child, our first secretive world building. Its relationship with the digital, though, is more assiduously hidden, but no less meaningful. There is little magic to a projector anymore, hence the joke of the paper figures around the mirror. The mirror itself is not enough. In order to more thoroughly understand the digital elements of the work, we could maybe look back beyond the contemporary publishing industry to the pre-cinematic moving images captured by magic lantern shows and shadow players of all kinds. The theatre book seems to riff on these forms more than cinema in its combination of static sets and lively moving elements within the bounds of the paper surface. The reader is sent out, as Hales noted, as with other digital text, to consider all kinds of moving images, all manner of references. But this is also a peculiarly 21st century product. These images, captured in this portable form, couldn't have been produced at any other point in history. The paper, the pop-up, the mirror, the light, the recorded sound, the engraved wooden box, these elements each have an extensive tradition of at least a century. But the paper here is connected to an Arduino and micro-switch system that changes the scenes. The pop-ups and the mirror and the light form an unfathomably tiny and accurate cinema, not the smallest screen in the world, but amongst the smallest practical gestalt of light thrown and received. The recorded sound is an MP3 played through a tiny amp and speakers. The box is laser etched. This is not a traditional item at any level. From the binary code of its underlying computer platform to the reassuring wood and print materiality that rests upon the table, it has been constantly mediated by digital processes. The theatre book derives much of its intensity, its meaningfulness, from its closing of the reciprocal loop between print and the digital. Printed pages are meant to be fixed, static, but here they are brought to life. The digital is meant to be ghostly, ephemeral, independent of the structures that mobilize it, but here it is located, bound up, and only makes sense within the particular surfaces that it animates and as it is triggered by their movements. It is in its weaving together of both forms and at this time that the meaning of each is heightened. The theatre book offers an antidote to fear in the face of the new and a commitment to showing the already present meaning-making potentials of existing forms. Above all else, this product implicates the reader in bringing the story to life, in producing the text, in conjuring up a world and making it matter, and in at least a couple of senses of that word. We might always question where a text is. In music, it is perhaps more readily problematic. Is the piece in the notation, the performance, the recording, or the act of listening? Does the text necessarily always subtly spread across each of these aspects as the reader, performer, or producer at each level is at least partially informed about and inflected by the other instantiations? In a printed book, is the text in the story's script, in the reader's head, or in some communion between the instantiation of the work, the reader, their cultural context, and the current milieu in which they find themselves? For the theatre book, the active role that the reader plays in writing her specific text is brought to the fore in her participation in actually creating each setting that the work manifests upon. Causing the space to emerge from the leaves of the book, their material presentation causes us to perform what we have always done. In our encounters with electronic pages and with print in the light of digitization, we are developing new, meaningful grammars, structures for comprehension which might also underpin authorial and other artistic strategies. By uniting our theorizations of the experience of new reading practices with artistic work committed to troubling and exploring the kinds of reading that can occur, there is a mutual enriching of all kinds of literary work and of the viable strategies for comprehending its impact. And this is important, because as it is increasingly built into our lives, digital technology is becoming humanized, made subtle, not jarring, truly deep, not ghostly or shallow, and meaning rich, like every prior page that has come before and held the words which move us. Thank you.
Thanks. So questions for Matt?
At one point you talked about the digital text is always embodied and talking about how it's not missing or not ephemeral, I suppose.
Yeah.
Can you talk about your choice of that word as opposed to physical or materiality, and in what way can you say that text is embodied, independent from a body?
Sure. I think that it's partially provocation, and it's partially because I've come to recognize embodiment as knowledge possessing. So this is like, I guess it's part of like a wider commitment to the book. So part of what I've wanted to talk about recently is the ways in which embodiment is always responsive to the world and to things that have come before it. So the example that I use in the book is of a stick insect, and its body knows more about the world than its mind ever could. Like, it looks like a stick because of its response to predators' eyes over thousands of years. And so its embodiment holds a particular kind of knowledge. And I compare that to a machete. So the machete, again, hasn't changed its shape in about 200 years, and it's this perfect way of a knife meeting the jungle. It has a knowledge in its form of what human-handedness is like, and it's a readable in that way. So I guess to me, embodiment is always a readable thing. And embodiment is always it holds knowledge within itself, and so I think bookish bodies do that as well. So when I say that a digital text is embodied, to me it's started to take on that particular kind of weight. It holds knowledge in a particular way, like it's responsive. That vaguely answer your question?
I'm closing in on it, I think. So it holds knowledge because if we were in a world where the humans were extinct, the digital technology would still be embodied because body for you is not necessarily a human body, it is a repository of knowledge.
Yeah, and as I start to think about this more and more, I'm pretty sure that applies to everything physical.
Right, so why not physical or material?
Because physicality and materiality in philosophy have been inert for a really long time, whereas embodiment to me just feels lively. So that's where I think the provocation comes out of it. If I say that a book is embodied, everyone's like, why? And so it's that kind of urge is to make you think, okay, so what makes our embodiment so different from the embodiment of insects, but also of kind of physical things, and it's because we're active in some way. Like, our embodiment reacts to the environment, but a book dropped in the bath or with coffee spilt on it is equally reactive and equally kind of can change in response to its environment, even though it's not self-animating. So I guess that it's part of a larger rhetorical device, I guess. Cool.
Much for your talk, and I'm kind of going to be asking a similar question as Amy. So at some point in the talk you said, I'm going to paraphrase, and before I ask my question I want you to tell me if this is like the right or wrong way to understand what you were saying. Something like the felt immateriality of the web, like that is to say in our phenomenology or phenomenological experiences of being on the web, there is this felt immateriality, but that's really a kind of ignorance of the real material, I don't know if I want to say causal or constitutive components that go into creating a program, a computer, the actual physical materials to the sort of the people who do the programming.
And what's going on the hard drive and all that kind of stuff.
So does that sound okay? So
yeah, perfect.
Okay, so I usually don't to talk about Hayler but I actually wonder if, so in my mind, I want to actually reverse that and say that the phenomenological immaterial feeling of the web is actually the right way to feel about the web, and it's only when the equipment breaks down, right? When the computer stops working or the program freezes or the key gets stuck, that you do think about material components of the computer, like the person who wasn't paying attention when they were doing their programming and messed up a line of code. And so it actually seems like it's kind of an essential aspect of the web that it be immaterial, because if the materiality was present to you, it would only make sense in the context of the web not working or the equipment not breaking.
But the tool analysis that you're quoting from is also, in that way, we'd be saying the hammer in use is ghostly and ephemeral, and that doesn't feel...
Right, until the hammer breaks, and then that's...
Then you pay attention to it.
It becomes present to you. So it's not it's like a necessary ignorance, not like...
Yeah. And I think phenomenologically that makes a lot of sense to me. And I completely agree with you on that level.
So it wasn't like okay, good.
But that strikes me as a problem ontologically, because we don't think of the hammer as a ghostly thing in use, like when we consider use at all. Like if we were to say that anything that we don't pay attention to somehow melts away, that I think is a mistake. And I think that is what happens when people extrapolate from the phenomenological experience towards reading digital text as being somehow ephemeral or not there. That you're mistaking experience for kind of like an ontological claim, and it's that slippage I think is problematic. I think like you're identifying exactly the thing that I'm trying to pin down. Like the hammer is very much there, the digital text is very much there, even if our immediate experience of it, it is kind of the same order of it melting away during use. So yeah, I agree and disagree at the same time. But yeah, that's definitely the issue, I think.
Thank you.
So have you gotten to use that book in your own teaching? Because I would think that a big use of that sort of project is that after reading that theater book, an average kind of student reader, the sorts of people that were trying to push this idea that meaning in a text, which is obviously I think a big still concern of us working in an English department, that meaning is made through this kind of dynamical relationship between the reader and the book and the environment, that after working with that sort of book, they would be able to then transfer that kind of idea to the printed book.
Yeah.
I think more what real readers are likely to see. So have you gotten to make use of this project with me?
So we got a prototyping grant, so that's the only one that exists in the world, and so we're not allowed to like touch it. The artist kind of covered it. No, there's a tour of a book called The Ice Book, which they made beforehand, which I think might currently be in the States. I'll have to look it up, but if you go to theicebook.com, like it shows you where it is, and that has a projector that's outside of the book projecting onto it, and that was their original thing. And so this is the first time that they've built something actually into the spine of the book, like projection technology's now got good enough. And so the next stage of the project is to start developing it as an art item which is scalable and sellable, but it's still going to be about $1,000 at the moment. Like it's really tied to the cost of Pico projectors. But the actual like laser cut book is fairly easy to produce. So as soon as the cost of Pico projectors come down, I think it could be like a classroom tool, and it would be so cool in creative writing departments to be able to write for that kind of text. I think it would be really fun.
Yeah, I mean, like I would love to teach the Tree of Codes book, but it's $150 or $200.
Tree of Codes?
Yeah.
Really? That's
they
so...
only printed like so many of them.
Yeah, I got one on the first print run, so I haven't checked the price for a while. It was like 15 quid.
Yeah.
I teach Tree of Codes in class, but by like handing out my copy, I didn't realize I was giving them a $200 book. That's interesting. That's the problem with teaching kind of experimental literature, is getting this stuff out in a lot of ways. Yeah. Thank you. Should we move on to Marco? I think there's going to be connections between what we're talking about.
Set up. Everyone can read on coffee.